Welcome back to another episode in our month of spooky Halloween content. If you haven't yet, be sure to go back to our first two episodes where we took a deep dive into Death Stranding and put characters from Super Smash Bros. Into popular horror franchises. On this episode, we're going to be listing out and discussing our favorite spooky/horror games. Welcome to the podcast where three longtime friends talk about video games from the average gamer's perspective. My name is Andrew Kimball.
I'm Dylan Wren.
And I'm Aubrey Summer.
And we are your friendly neighborhood gamers.
Before we dive in, I want to remind you that we are on Instagram, TikTok, and X, where you can keep up with the show and enjoy our short form content. We're also on YouTube, where we post video essays, rankings, reviews, and more. And if you want to be part of future episodes like this one, or if you just want to chat with us and the awesome members of our community, join our Discord with the link in the podcast description. Before we kind of dive into our lists, I was curious, because I'm sure there's going to be some scrutiny. What do we think qualifies a game to be on this list? Aside from the fact that it's our podcast and we can do whatever we want. And if you don't like it, you can go make your own podcast. But like, just kind of generally, like when we think spooky game or like horror game, what are we thinking?
I know for me, I'm thinking like a game that specifically kind of bills itself as a horror game. Not just something that has like spooky or maybe unsettling or tense vibes, like something that's trying to be like more on that scary, spooky horror side of things. For me personally, that's subjective.
But is that in, I was going to say, is that in like content, tone, jump scares?
I mean, I think most of mine, it's like the content of the game, the story of the game, the like, it is a like survival horror game, or, you know, like it bills itself in its genre, I guess, kind of as a horror game for the most part. I think like looking at my lists and my honorable mentions and stuff, I'm pretty sure most of them are like stuff that is throwing like horror in there somewhere. It's like an action adventure horror game or this kind of a horror game, you know. But that's just me. That's subjective, you know, like.
Well, I think it's something that's going to come up. But like looking at some of the games on your honorable mention, it's like Alien Isolation, a game where you're running from the alien, you're basically helpless, versus State of Decay, which is pretty low stakes horror other than the permadeath. Like it's not trying to build the same level of tension.
Yeah.
As like an Alien Isolation. So that's I guess that's kind of what I had in mind with this question, is like, it seems to me like the content of the game might be the most,
like for me,
like the crux.
Yeah. I think of it as it's got some kind of like monster, you know, or some kind of,
there's some entity that's chasing you out to get you.
Yeah. Like not like, oh, Bowser, you know, like I don't consider Super Mario Brothers or whatever like a horror game just because Bowser is maybe a monster or what, you know, like it's some sort of like spooky, scary, you know, like zombies or alien entity,
and like,
or, you know,
targeting an adult audience of like, if that monster catches you, it's gonna rip your head off. There's gonna be blood everywhere. Like it's, you know, if Mario falls or gets caught by the Koopa or whatever, he loses life, restarts the level. It's all colorful and wahoo.
Yeah. And I don't think this is a requirement of like these games, but most of the ones that are on my list tend to be ones where you're able to be a little bit more active in them. You're not just like running away. Like Alien Isolation is probably one of the most like, and that's on my honorable mentions of, one of the most, you don't have a ton of options until later in the game where you get like a flamethrower and stuff.
Yeah, I think something kind of at the core of games that do allow you to fight back is that you always feel like you're on the edge of not being able to fight back. Like I have Left 4 Dead on my honorable mention, which is very much a just kind of power fantasy set in like a horror genre, but that's not really the typical MO for these games. Usually it's much more of a, like Resident Evil, they say that the game is kind of monitoring your ammunition so that the enemies take longer to kill if you have a bunch of ammo, but then they'll die faster if you have less, in order to kind of always give you that feeling of like you're about to run out of ammo and you're not going to be able to survive. And I think that's something that games like this do versus games with combat or shooters where it's like, I have unlimited ammo essentially, and I'm like, the enemies in this game need to fear me.
Yeah.
Well, and I know I skew more towards the ones where you're kind of like always kind of feeling like you're on the verge of not being able to fight back, just because like at the end of the day, at least for me, I'm always like, oh, okay, like this is a video game. There's that detachment from like the things that are going on screen and me, because I know that I am in my room with a controller in my hands playing them. And so a lot of the ones like Outlast, I guess, is a good example. It didn't make my honorable mentions because I kind of just found it boring and not that scary, because all of the ones where you can't fight back, you have to run away. There's always like, it's a game. So mechanically, they have to have a way that you can run away in those games, And so like once I kind of saw like behind the curtain and was like, okay, I understand how this mechanic works, it was like, well, this isn't that challenging anymore. It's not that scary, because like, yeah, there are these like weird crazy people wandering around that want to eat me, but here is this one's patrol path, and as long as I don't go while he's looking at me, like it's not that, like the mechanic of the game itself, it was like, oh, okay, like I understand the mechanic, and now it's lost some of that like spookiness in my mind. Another one that was like that was Layers of Fear, which was kind of like a horror walking sim that I played through, and like it was good, but it was also one of those where it was like, it wasn't scary to me, because every time, like they would have some jump scares, they would have some stuff, but like every time that there was something really spooky going on, it was kind of just like, as long as you don't have that like freeze response, fight, flight, or freeze, as long as you're not freezing, you have plenty of time to like walk away because like it's a game. They can't just insta kill you, and if they do, it was a like scripted thing that was supposed to happen, versus things like Dead Space, Resident Evil, that sort of thing, where to me it feels much more like, am I supposed to fight in this situation, or do I need to run? Like that extra layer of decision making makes it a little bit spookier for me, because of like, there are some things you're not really supposed to try to fight in those games. You're supposed to kind of just run away. And since it lets you fight, you have to like kind of be the judge of like, am I supposed to fight this right now? Or like, Resident Evil 2, where Mr. X is pursuing you, or the Nemesis is pursuing you. It's like, okay, am I supposed to try to fight him right now, or do I just need to run away? That makes it a little bit more spooky for me.
And it's a little more impactful in a game where normally you can fight back, to then be faced with an enemy that you can't beat, at least like in that moment. And so then the like, oh no, oh no, oh no, oh no, and like running and getting away and getting to cover is like a little more severe.
Yeah.
And I think having the designated save spots too, where like, oh, I'm going to lose so much progress. Like,
yeah,
that helps add to the tension.
Mm-hmm. Kind of that Bloodborne thing.
Yeah, for me, it doesn't really matter. Like the sound design, the audio design, the darkness, the having to be the one to make the character go forward into the situation where I know there's going to be a jump scare or something I have to run from or whatever. Like it pretty much always works on me. I can tell myself that I'm just playing a game over and over, but it's like if they did their job with the vibe, like with the tone, then it usually gets me. Yeah. Now, some things can be, like you said, maybe a little too over the top or a little too cheesy or whatever and kind of break that immersion. If that happens, then it's not that big of a deal. But like even my first time through Bloodborne, like I inched my way through that game because I wasn't sure if like a werewolf was going to burst out, because that happened once and I was like, whoa, wasn't expecting that. And so it's just kind of that like me having the agency of putting the character into the like situation is kind of what causes that anxiety. And so for me it's about the content. Like it has to deal with, like you said, like monsters, like zombies, cosmic horror, some sort of like evil entity, some demonic thing, like something that falls in that like horror category. But for me, like, yeah, it doesn't have to necessarily be like an Outlast or an Alien Isolation or something that's like just super intensely horror, because I don't really play games like that. So for me, it's a lot of like more about the setting and what's going on. Like, you're a big fan of like Call of Cthulhu and the Sinking City and games like that. And I think that those would fit the bill, because even though they might not be like
horror.
Yeah, they're not like the scariest games to play, and they're probably not going to make like any top 10 list of like most impactful horror games. But like for me, it's the tone, it's the setting, it's the lighting. It's like it's definitely, that's the vibe. Like if I was going to put it in a category, it would be much closer to some sort of horror game than it would be like a cozy puzzle game.
Yeah, I was gonna say, for me, it's the like Sinking City is like a very like sort of detective investigation game with like Lovecraft influence over top of it, so
yeah, my answer would also be kind of vibes, just the sort of general energy that it brings. I don't play a lot of horror. I do enjoy watching it. Not like films, but like watching like Markiplier play it. I think he does remarkably well with horror games. And
is that because of the player agency thing that I mentioned?
For sure. Yeah. One of the games on my list I'll talk about a little more. I watched him play and he did like so well with it that I was like, oh yeah, that actually looks pretty fun. And then I got it. And then when I had to make character go and deal with like the lack of resources and everything, I was like, oh no, this sucks. Like, and was like still on my shelf. I'd still love to be able to get to the point where I could get through that, but it is still very much like not my style of genre. But if it's got like spooky enough vibes and like a spooky energy, but not that kind of like action survival horror like a Resident Evil game, I feel like I could approach it a little better. Like something like Little Nightmares it's like nasty and spooky and looks terrible and everything, but because it is like a puzzle platformer, I feel like I could do pretty well in that, because like that is a gameplay style that I feel a little better in. That being said, it is still like a freaky looking game, and it has not been appealing enough to draw me in yet, but
it's one I want to check out, because like on my honorable mentions I have Inside, which is kind of the same concept, where it's like, it's atmospheric, it's moody, you're getting chased by like rabid dogs, you're getting chased by like shadowy figures with lights and guns, and you don't really know their intentions and what all, but it's like it's side scrolling and it's kind of like a 2D puzzle game, like platformer, and it's like I feel a lot more detached from that perspective than third person, and especially first person.
So like vibes and perception, and it feels like, the Beetlejuice kind of horror versus I don't know, Saw or Texas Chainsaw Massacre or something like that. Like, it's like so stylized and different and outrageous, and it still has that like horror energy to it, but it's so unreal. It helps you kind of distance yourself from the spooks a bit. But yeah, it's all vibes and atmosphere for me.
Now,
and then gameplay that I can actually participate in.
Now, would you guys a game that we've kind of talked about on the show before, Hellblade 2? Would you guys put that in the horror camp, or is that more of like a thriller? Like, because that's always, I guess, kind of the line of like what's horror versus thriller in like film, and I feel like we don't really have that kind of distinction necessarily in video games, and obviously horror is subjective to everybody. But like, would you guys consider Hellblade a horror game, or do you consider it more of like a thriller? Like, is it psychological horror? Like, what would you guys consider it?
I would put the first game as like a psychological horror, because there's some like stealth like sections where you're trying to get away from the shadowy figures. There's a lot of just kind of like mind-bending, really screwed up, messed up imagery, and like wading through rivers of blood with like corpses reaching out at you and stuff like that. So I think the first one, I think I would definitely put in that horror space. I think the second one is probably more thriller.
Yeah, that's kind of tricky, because I'm trying to think about some of the elements and stuff in it. I would put it more in horror than just like a straight action type thing, and I guess I'm trying to think of it in terms of like movie versus game. But I don't think its goal is to be horrifying, if that makes sense. Like, they set out to like demonstrate and put you in her shoes, but I don't feel like their intent was to like freak you out.
I don't know. I think they're trying to freak you out with like the experience that she's going through. Like, her experience is freak, because they could have done a much more zany approach to the topic that they were trying to cover, but they decided to go for a very like dark, bloody, kind of spooky approach to it.
Yeah, and again, it's hard to quantify, and obviously you can't, like, arguing intent for art is kind of silly and pointless, but the impression that I got was like nothing, which feels crazy to say thinking about the way that some of those sequences made my heart pound, and how I like was like, I don't want to go in there, I don't want to do that, like, like, there were plenty of moments where I had like the response that I would have to a horror game, to that game, but it didn't feel like, I don't know, it didn't feel like the game was messing with me. Like, they weren't trying to have, ooh, gotcha moments, like, sort of a thing. I think it just had like heavy, heavy, heavy atmosphere.
But I don't think all horror is like trying to get you either. Like, I don't.
Yeah, not all.
There are.
Yeah, some is very jump scare heavy, some is not. But yeah, I think you guys are kind of demonstrating very well kind of that, like, it's subjective to everybody, and if you thought it was a spooky horror game, then you were right. It is a spooky horror game. If it didn't spook you out, that's fine too. Like, you know? Mm-hmm. So, because yeah, I think, like you were saying, Aubrey, like, art is hard to pin down necessarily. You know, it's kind of like, yeah, I mean, some people could look at, I'm trying to look at some of the, like, Bloodborne and be like, oh, Bloodborne is a very spooky horror game. Other people are like, no, it's an action game, you know, like, so what I'm saying is, if you don't think that these games are horror games in the comments, they may not be horror games to you, but they are to some of us.
Yeah, it's weird that I think intent has like so much sway. Like, what were the developers going for? What was their goal?
Yeah.
Especially because, again, that's such a hard thing to quantify, but it's this like intangible element that.
Yeah. Well, in some, I think the level too. Like some games are very clearly like what was that Scorn game? Was it Scorn, the body horror like game that came out on Xbox last year?
Scorn.
Mm.
That was very clearly meant to be like a body horror game. You
Right.
know, that other one that was made by the old Dead Space developers.
Callisto.
Yeah, Callisto
Callisto
Protocol.
Protocol.
Like they leaned very heavily into like this is supposed to be a horror game. So like sometimes the developers will really kind of like let you know that we mean for this to be a horror game. I think it's when they kind of ride that line of like I think horror is easier to recognize when it is like gross or when it is like jump scary than when it's kind of like Annihilation is a movie that I really like that is I think a horror movie but is also not very like when you think of a lot of other horror movies it is not really that like you know and but
Yeah.
the vibes and the atmosphere and the story and everything it's very cosmic horror and so it's like you know it's not just jump scares it's not like Jason Voorhees running down after somebody, but it is like I think horror is a lot easier to recognize when it fits in the mold of like a slasher or you know like
Serial
something like
killers
Yeah,
and
yeah.
murder traps. Like,
Well, because being horrified and being scared are two different things. You know, they're different emotions. Like being horrified has a layer of like disgust and shock and unreality and I can't believe and you know there's a certain element of like who comes up with this stuff with horror versus just like something being scary or scaring you.
Yeah.
And like Hellblade scared me sometimes, but I didn't have a like, oh my God moment with it.
Yeah. Well, and like on our previous episode, we threw Jaws in there, I think, as like a, you know, a horror movie. But I mean, I think a lot of people would be like, that's not scary, you know, and those people don't live on
it
an
was
ocean.
when it came out.
So-
Yeah, I was gonna say.
Uh-huh.
I remember my like dad telling stories about how like his little brother didn't want to go to the bathroom because he thought a shark was going to come out of the toilet. Like that movie terrified a generation, but
Yep.
it just
Mhm.
wasn't our generation.
Mhm.
Well, because you think about stuff too, like, say, Psycho. Like,
Mhm.
yes, he was a killer, and it was very scary that he was killing all these people who stayed at the Bates Motel. But what made it horrifying was that he was dressing up as his dead mother and that he had her, like, in the basement and, like, heard her fussing at him all the time. Like, and that, like, layer is what made it, like, so terrifying. Jaws is just a masterclass in tension. I can't handle that movie. I just
Well,
need,
and
I need stuff
it's
to
the same.
happen.
It's the same idea as like Star Wars. Like people had never seen
Mm-hmm.
that on the TV before, and it was like, holy crap! You know, like this
Yeah,
seems
and
so real. Yeah.
it was something they could have never imagined, and so that when they saw it, it horrified them.
But also like the stories of that giant robotic animatronic shark like malfunctioning and stuff are also just kind of terrifying. The movie has like a mythos to it, but
Yeah,
Yeah.
the way that so many people could have gotten hurt. But it worked in its favor too, because the shark was going to feature a lot more heavily in the.
yeah, no, it's the classic like less is more thing that
Mhm.
ended up working in its favor. But anyways, let's go ahead and kick this thing off. Aubrey, why don't you start? What is your number 3 game?
Well, quick shout out to my honorable mentions of Phasmophobia, just because that's probably the quote unquote horror game I've played the most.
It is a good horror game.
Very fun and very quite accessible. I don't play super spooky games, so the fact that I played that as much as I did was pretty remarkable. And then also shout out, not spooky at all, but great vibes were the Halloween events in Animal Crossing. Collecting, giving out candy and collecting candy and all that stuff. Like Animal Crossing was is really great about the seasonal events. And so when I think of this time of year and the spooky season and stuff like that, obviously Animal Crossing is going to come to mind. But my number 3 pick is The Evil Within 2. Markiplier did a series of live streams of it, and I watched them. It was between graduating college and gaining employment, so I was actually available at 10 a.m. on like Tuesdays when he would stream it. And he would do like a 4-hour stream. He had a great running bit. He would do melee attacks, and this is not going to convey how humorous it was, but anytime he'd like sneak up on an enemy and stab them in the brain with the knife, he'd pretend he was like a waiter taking their order and telling them like the soup of the day. And so he would try and come up with a different soup every time he did it. And that had me convinced that it wasn't that scary a game. So when I found it on sale at GameStop and picked it up, both 1 and 2, I was like, well, I've seen him do a full playthrough. I know what to expect. I have a rough idea of how the combat is. I'll play it on baby mode. And when you get through the initial story, the premise of the game is your Detective Sebastian Castellanos, who in the first game, you come across this like unreality machine that puts you in like, it's like Inception, but horror. So you're in a dream and it's like controlled by the mind of somebody. And if the mind that's controlling it is like fucked up, the world becomes fucked up. So in the second game, after you've escaped in like the first one and everything, you're approached by the people who developed the technology and are like, hey, so you know your daughter that you thought died in a fire years and years ago? She's actually still alive, and they're using her as like the seed and the brain that's controlling this second like attempt that we're doing. But she's gone missing. We can't get to her. Things are going like awry. And we need you to go in and, we'll let you save her and like have her back if you will fix up our mess. So he willingly goes there, gets plugged into the world, and is pretty immediately like taken captive by this nasty big monster guy with like chainsaws for hands or whatever. And it's gross and cutting up bodies, and you gotta sneak out because you don't have any gear or anything. And
sounds awful.
Oh, it was by the time I got to the end of Markiplier's live streams, when he had all the guns and he had all the everything and the final like big fight at the end of like unreal outrageousness, whatever, I was like, yeah, this seems really fun. And I forgot about how in the very beginning you have to escape from chainsaw wielding nasty monster man in a bloody butchery area. So I don't think I even escaped that guy before I was like, oh, I can't do this. What was I thinking? Like, what was this? But it's got a really fascinating story, which is what I love about a lot of like horror games and movies and concepts, is they always have such interesting premises. I just can't engage with it. Like, it's too spooky for me. So, sorry, the cat just walked across the keyboard. So typically what I'll end up doing is like just reading about the plot on Wikipedia, or if it's a game, watching somebody else play it or something along those lines, because the storytelling in horror games it's pretty top notch. Like, it's pretty interesting, and they're doing stuff that a lot of other stories don't do. But it's just engaging with it in the medium it was intended to is pretty tough. So that's part of why I enjoy Markiplier so much, is because he can handle the spooks and stuff. Like, obviously, early on in the like Five Nights at Freddy's era and all that, there was a fair bit of shrieking and YouTube man reaction type stuff. But he's definitely like leveled out as he's gotten older and handles it like a lot more maturely. There's still some funny jokes and shrieks, and if something catches him off guard, because that's entertaining to watch people get scared by stuff. But
yeah,
so yeah, it's such a cool concept, because so everything went tits up in this game because they were trying to like build a whole town in this dream dimension type stuff, and so they plugged a bunch of people in there. And then, oh my gosh, we don't know how it happened. This crazy serial killer guy somehow got in there. We don't know. Yeah, they knew. They were aware. And so he's somehow taking control of it and is using it to basically kill everybody. And so you got to stop him. And a lot of really fascinating and mind-bending is a little generous, but very interesting ways.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I'm a much bigger fan of their most recent offering, Hi-Fi Rush.
Right. Yeah. Yeah,
Much
I did look
more
that
your
up
speed.
because I was like, both of these games are on Game Pass, right? Like, after
Yeah,
I
Xbox
finish all of my homework,
Owns them.
I may jump into these games. Because,
Mhm.
yeah, like, they do sound very interesting.
They're very Resident Evil.
Yeah. Seems
Nice.
like it could be cool.
What's your number 3, Dylan?
Well, should I go through some honorable mentions first or no?
Oh, yeah, I was
Yeah,
going to
throw 'em
do
out
that
there.
at the end, but Aubrey kind of flipped the script on me, so go ahead.
Okay.
They did.
So
I do
I'll
what I
shout
want.
out a bunch of honorable mentions because I think out of the three of us, I am the one that does the most horror stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll shout out Dead by Daylight. That one did not make my list because I exclusively play the killer side of things, which is not very scary because I am the thing that is making people scared. I'll shout out Bloodborne because, again, cosmic horror stuff, but I personally, like, for me, it's more of like an action RPG type of thing. I will shout out Plague Tale here. Plague Tale is amazing, but did not make my list. Alan Wake 2 probably would have made my list had I beaten it, but I have not had the time to sit down and actually play it all. So if we do this list again, I will probably have Alan Wake 2 there. First game had some spooks, but also was rough. Phasmophobia, I'll shout out for the reasons Aubrey shouted it out. It seemed really cool. Alien Isolation, I didn't finish, but I was enjoying it. I got distracted by some other game. Prey is a similar story where I was enjoying it, got distracted by another game, but had some very good spookiness. Dredge is probably the one that I would say is the least spooky on this list for me personally. But if you are curious about Dredge, it is kind of a cozy fishing mini game that has also got like a Lovecraftian thing kind of put over the top of it. We have a video on YouTube. Go check it out. I'll shout out Hunt Showdown. Some spookiness in there, especially if you dig into the lore. Hellblade, Call of Duty Zombies, State of Decay, The Sinking City, Call of Cthulhu, and the Dead Rising series, which progressed from horror. It was always zany, but it, like, the first game is the most horror of them, and then as you progress down the line, it just becomes more and more on the like comedy side and less on the horror side.
Yeah.
Isn't that the one that was banned in Australia?
I don't know.
That's a long list of games.
Yeah, I don't know.
Dead Rising is the series where you can like drive a golf cart through a horde of zombies while wielding a lightsaber wearing a Mega Man costume.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It gets outrageous, but
So my number 3 game, though, is I cheated and just put Supermassive Games here. Basically, all of the
All of them.
Supermassive games, I love them. Even the ones that are not that great, I like.
I was going to say, so this
To
proves
all of
that
them.
games don't have to be scary for them to be on your horror list.
Well, okay, some of the Supermassive games are much more spooky. You just haven't played them.
Yeah, some of them are, but you put the whole list.
Yeah.
put all of them.
Which
'Cause,
I would say
there are scary
the
parts of all
majority
the
are
games.
campy, but yes.
Yeah. So I enjoy the Supermassive games. I like sort of the choose your own adventure nature of them. And they are, like Andrew said, very campy. And I do enjoy like campy horror as well. You know, like that's, if I'm going to watch a horror movie, like it's going to be like a campy horror movie for the most part.
It's going to be a camper.
It's gonna be a real camper of a
Campy
story.
horror camper.
Mm-hmm.
But, of Supermassive's roster, not all of them are, 10 out of 10 bangers in my book. But
What?
I do enjoy them. I probably view them more favorably than a lot of people. And I think some of that too is just I think it's fun to get together with a bunch of people that don't routinely play horror games and have them play. That's, Aubrey was talking about watching Market. It is fun to watch other people experience a horror game and get all worked up and oh my goodness, there's this craziness going on, that is more
so you
fun.
can just say Abby and Delaney.
Well, and you. And,
not on this most recent one, but yes.
Well, yeah. But yeah, no, it is. I do enjoy that aspect of it. And, were I just playing these solo, I don't know that I'd be as high on them. But since pretty much I almost exclusively play them in a group setting where it's fun to watch it's similar to if you're gonna watch a horror movie with friends that don't normally watch horror movies, you're gonna get the more campy stuff probably, your Cabin in the Woods or the It from the 1990s or something like that versus Saw. So
Friday the 13th 4 or whatever.
Yeah.
Well, they're similar to
where Jason goes to space or whatever that one.
They're similar to kind of the Joseph Ferris games of It Takes Two and A Way Out, where it's it's really cool that they exist because they kind of provide a very one of a kind and unique experience, especially for friends to play together. But then beyond the gimmick is a really harsh word to use, but beyond the kind of concept of, yeah, you can play them as a group and experience them together. It's the core content of those games definitely falls more to the kind of cheesy, campy, and then in some cases just sort of rushed and poorly held together.
Yeah.
But what they do, the idea behind them with the pass the controller and the choose your own adventure and stuff like that is really unique and really cool in that in the genre and just kind of in video games in general. So I do appreciate them for that.
Yeah. And I mean, they are all trying to be horror. Their level of success at that varies wildly. We haven't played probably the one that is the most scary, which would probably be Until Dawn,
which was also before they kind of shifted into this whole group thing. It was
and a lot of Until Dawn and The Quarry are kind of outside, and I guess Casting of Frank Stone are all kind of outside of the Dark Pictures. Dark Pictures, a lot of times they're trying to more heavily lean into the psychological aspects of it. There's usually some sort of weird psychological twist in those ones, which in my opinion sometimes detracts a little bit from some of the spooks, but they're all still trying to be a psychological horror game, or Until Dawn or The Quarry, where this is The Quarry was specifically trying to be a campy horror movie. Until Dawn is kind of, I can't talk a whole lot about it because that's part of the plot is what it is trying to do.
Yeah, I mean, it's still a bunch of young adults going out into a cabin, and
I mean, it does follow a lot of
stuff
horror
goes
movie
awry.
Tropes. So,
but it was trying to be a more legit version of that versus The Quarry being more, but oh, we're all at summer camp kind of.
But yeah, I really enjoy those games, so that is number 3 on my list.
Yeah, and they are number 1 on my list. Spoilers, and that's one where the concept saves it, because they're genuinely, by a lot of objective measures, not very good. Even not good. Being number 1, Mass Effect Andromeda Defender. Clearly, I don't need that to enjoy a game or to enjoy the experience of playing a game. But yeah, for all of the reasons Dylan stated above, it's probably the only time I play like a straight up horror game is when we do a supermassive game, and being able to treat it like a campy B horror movie. Like, I think the rough writing and the bizarre delivery of said rough writing really helps to take the teeth out of some of the like scarier stuff, which makes it objectively a worse horror experience, but makes it a better co-op gaming experience.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I will say, I don't think, Andrew, you've experienced probably the scariest of the Dark Pictures anthology. I would say of all of them, Little Hope managed to be the scariest at a lot of times, mostly because you spend most of the game just walking through the woods in the dark.
Yeah. There's a lot more running from the bad things in that game than pretty much any other Dark Pictures anthology game that I've played. So,
yeah. And I don't know if you'll hear about this after, if you've already heard about this, but the casting of Frank Stone was not an impressive experience. So
they will be hearing about that. Yes.
They will be hearing about that. Yeah. I don't know if I'll talk more about this when we get to the number ones or not, but that's my blurb I'll throw in there for now.
Cool.
What's your number 3, Andrew?
Well, my honorable mentions, since we're doing those now, I throw out Hellblade, The Last of Us 1 and 2, The Quarry.
Only The Quarry, not the Supermassive games.
Correct.
Threw out Inside, Left 4 Dead, and Days Gone, which Days Gone was the closest to making it on my list. I was about to put it at number 3, but I didn't want my list to be that predictable. I thought I'd throw one wrench in there. But also, I got to thinking about what my actual number 3 is, and I thought it was a little bit more interesting to talk about for a minute. And my actual number 3 that I picked was The Walking Dead Season 1, which that's Telltale's The Walking Dead. So this game we all are pretty much aware of Telltale games at this point. Their art style, their MO. Yeah. It's all about making decisions that ultimately just flavor the experience, but don't actually really change it too much. But The Walking Dead was their breakout game. Season 1 was like the first really big success they had. And so at the time, you didn't really know how impactful your decisions were. And similar to the show The Walking Dead, which was running at the same time and was like at the height of its popularity, the game is based off of the comics. But the choices you had to make were very tough. It was like very life or death, this character, that character. Yeah. You know, you didn't know exactly what the outcome, what the right choice was. There was no right or wrong necessarily. It was similar to, like any other great game that throws choices in your face, where it's like sometimes you make what seems like the right choice in that moment and it ends up kind of backfiring on you later. And so I don't know why I started playing it, probably because I was just really into the show at the time.
Yeah, I think it got given away for free, or maybe the first episode was free.
Episode 1 was free. Telltale does that for all their games. So maybe I played the first episode and was like, wow, this is actually really good. And so you play as a criminal, a convict who's like being driven to prison, and then the apocalypse breaks out. And so you're playing as this kind of morally gray character already, but he seems like a good guy that maybe was in the wrong place, wrong time kind of thing, but they don't give you like enough of the backstory for that to be like 100% sure. Like he could just be a criminal. And then the game goes through the story over 5 episodes or whatever, like Telltale usually does, of you meeting with other survivors, kind of creating this like family. You meet this little girl named Clementine, kind of like develop a father-daughter bond with her. And like in season 1, there are like in episode 1, like it just throws some pretty intense choices at you of like saving a child or, you know, somebody like there's just a lot of things that it throws at you that are really intense considering you're looking at this kind of janky cartoony art style where like the characters move like puppets because they didn't afford like motion capture. But then of course, like as it goes through, like there's a whole section on like overly friendly people that turn out to be cannibals and like, you know, just all these different things that are very much in line with The Walking Dead and horror and zombie stories. And then it ends with like one of the most infamous kind of sad endings in video games. Like this season 1 is consistently on lists of like tragic endings, and I'm not going to spoil it here, but it's one of those games that like you finish it, credits are rolling, and you're just kind of like sitting there with that like heavy feeling of what did I just experience? And I think when something like kind of like leaves that impression on you, it's definitely like, I think that was kind of what made me put it on my list versus Days Gone. Because like Days Gone just checks basically every box for me as far as video games I like, and happens to be a zombie game. Yeah. So it's like it technically makes the cut. But like this game, it was a bit of a surprise at the time. Like we're all looking back, like Telltale just crapped out a ton of games, some of them really great, some of them not so great, and like their formula became well known. It started to become very obvious that like, oh, you're just kind of flavoring these stories. You can't really change the through line of them. But like playing The Walking Dead season 1 at the time, because I played it pretty much around release, it was a really truly special experience. And honestly, I think like even knowing everything you know about Telltale, and even if you've had the ending spoiled for you, I think it's worth playing through. I think it's a really solid experience. It's probably like peak Telltale. It's like this game, Wolf Among Us, and Tales from the Borderlands, and honestly the Batman probably are like their best. Yeah. But I never played Beyond season 1. I think I have some, because they did like
I think they're all in Game
2
Pass,
seasons of Michonne. Yeah, I think you can play a lot of them on Game Pass. And then they did like 3 or 4 more seasons of like the core story, but season 1 like I can definitely see continuing playing them, and they're probably decent, but like it also just kind of feels like just play season 1 and you will get that experience.
Well, those are games that like I think could be are ones we may play as like a group at some point, even if
they're not built specifically for that, but I think they would be a good experience, just kind of like to do that
voting with. On, you know, choices and that sort of thing as a group. Like if they were made today, I do feel like there'd either be like pass the controller or like some sort of like built-in couch co-op feature, you know.
You say that, but like new Tales from the Borderlands came out like last year, and I don't think had any of that.
Yeah. Who knows? Because those are very much like games that I would want to play more with other people, but also like they're kind of built to be played solo. But I do think it'd be interesting to like try out some of those, because we may look into doing more of that kind of thing every couple months. So
I think season 1 would definitely be a good one, because there's a lot of just like gut punch heartbreaking moments pretty much, and like shocking moments, and like characters that you dislike initially but grow to love, or characters you want to save but can't, and just a lot of that like early Walking Dead and like early Game of Thrones kind of writing, where it was like the writing doesn't care about your feelings kind of thing.
Yeah, like everybody's life was on the table, and that's what made those shows interesting and fun at the time, was because no character was safe from being killed off, you know, versus the traditional thing where it's like, oh, well, this is the main character. They're not just going to kill him. And if they are, it's going to be like this huge lead up production to it, you know? So.
Right.
They're not just going to write this person off. They will. And they did. And I stopped watching.
Yeah, ultimately with The Walking Dead, that kind of like made the show implode, but that's another conversation. Aubrey, number 2, go ahead and throw out your pick that will validate everything else the rest of us choose, because what did you pick for number 2?
I picked Night in the Woods for number 2. It's not like scary. There are definitely some moments of tension, but this is one where like the vibes carry it all off.
It's scary because you have to reconcile with your feelings.
Right? You have to come to terms with who you are as a person. It, again, because I was thinking more spooky season than like spooky. I just recently, this past week, watched Over the Garden Wall, which is a limited series that Cartoon Network put out many years ago. And I never got around to watching it. And I finally did watch it this year because there was a whole kerfuffle when like Hulu pulled it. And then like right before October, and everybody's like, oh, it's lost media now because it never got a physical release. And this is why you should, pirate things. And Night in the Woods has a very similar energy of like, it's not strictly scary, but it ain't like quite right.
Mm-hmm. Like an unsettling almost.
Yeah, like it's a little off, it's a little spooky. And then, I mean, May obviously has not like, it's not a game you can fight in. So when you're faced with, oh, there, an arm showed up and transients are going missing, and what does that all mean? And you're in, this spooky guy in a costume like just appears in the background of the scene while you're investigating a graveyard. Like the energy is, it feels very Halloween.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
And I tried to stick to games that I have actually played for this list, which limited me severely.
Right.
So Night in the Woods made the list because it's got the right vibes. It feels very Halloween. It feels like if it was a story like read over like in podcast form, a la Welcome to Night Vale or the Magnus Archives, it could very easily be presented as like an audio horror with the right presentation in that. So
yeah, I
that
see
is
that.
why I made my list. And I just love that game and love talking about that game.
Well,
shocking.
We we have all played a very solid chunk of that game, so maybe we'll do like a full deep dive at some point in the future.
Mm-hmm.
Dylan, what's your number 2?
My number 2 is the Resident Evil series.
The whole series.
I can't speak for every game, but the games that I have played, I have enjoyed. And they bill themselves as a survival horror series, like even them. I would definitely say like 1 and 2 were very survival horror, and then like 3 and 4 and 5 and 6 kind of got more into like an action-y horror, and then 7
for sure
definitely kind of like rebooted it, took it back to the more survival horror like kind of roots. And then 8 was kind of a mix of both, I would say. Parts of it were definitely way more survival horror, parts of it were definitely way more action. But it is a series of games that I enjoy. And I like the weird, dumb story. I like I like the sort of like tension that it creates, because in all of these games, it does give you ways to fight back, but then it frequently kind of like takes away your ability to fight back, or just, like throws something at you that is not like you can't really fight back against it, even if you have like your access to your weapons and stuff. And so I do enjoy that. And I think it does a good job of, like Andrew talked about earlier, they like the programming of it to keep it tense. It like kind of watches how much ammo and how many resources you have. And so like it'll make certain enemies like, a headshot in this game does not necessarily insta kill a zombie like you would expect in almost any other game that you play.
Yeah, right.
And that can be frustrating at times for me and a lot of people, I'm sure, that play this game, because it's like video games especially have trained us to, you shoot zombie in head, it dies immediately, and so when you unload like 5 45 magnum shots into a zombie's head and it doesn't die, and you're just kind of like, why are you still up and walking around? That can be a little bit frustrating, but I do think it does a good job of, like, once you kind of understand how those games work, it does a good job of like keeping it tense, because it's like, okay, I have ammo, but that doesn't necessarily mean like that I have enough ammo to take on like these 7 zombies that are coming towards me,
Right.
Mhm.
And I have, or, I think it makes a lot of games that give you a gun turn way more actiony. Like you can see with, the rest of the Resident Evil series, because it makes more sense. But I think specifically some of the Resident Evil games, but all of them to some extent, do a good job of keeping that tension going, because they do, like, fighting, like they put you in that spot where there isn't an obvious right answer. Like there's not the runaway answer or the fight answer that is like winning out all the time. There's not always the right choice. And so that extra, few seconds that you spend trying to figure out, like, okay, do I need to try to fight these zombies? Do I need to kind of like try to run through them without getting grabbed? How does this work? I think makes it more interesting. Plus, in a lot of them, they've added in the like thing that is just kind of like randomly patrolling around and will occasionally like spot you and chase you down, and you just have to like run away,
Yeah.
And I think those are always very well done.
Yeah, the Resident Evil games feel kind of like the whole package
Mhm.
a lot of the time. Like there's some spooks, there's some survival, there's some like, calling them puzzles would be a little generous, but there is like
Well,
you
they're
gotta
puzzles.
go find.
They just like don't really make sense usually in the world. It's like, hey,
Yeah.
find this statue and make it the shadow of it look like a bird.
No, that
into
makes
this
sense
light.
because it was in actually an ancient or an old museum or something. I forget what the.
Yeah.
I forget. There's always a
Exactly.
reason that is like that.
It's just not one that you would think of. But
Yeah.
there are puzzles, and then with the limited resources, and like you were saying, like, oh, I don't know if I have enough to take out all of these zombies. There's a level of strategy and how you have to approach it. Like it's the whole package. I can see why it's such a beloved series, even when it jumped the shark or, punched the boulder.
Literally.
Punch the boulder. Classic.
And then, yeah, with 7 bringing it like right back to the really like truly horrifying like survival horror roots.
Even though he's reattaching his hand with like
Even though you
liquid
see
glue or
Ethan
whatever.
survive things, that there's
and he
there's
never
no
shows
way.
his
There's
face.
There's a reason. There's a reason for that, Andrew.
There
yeah,
is
but
a
it's
reason.
still stupid.
That's correct.
I mean, yeah. You say that like Leon isn't also like healing himself from bullet wounds and zombie bites with the same goop.
Well, no, like I thought like those are stupid too. But you were like, and then they got back to their like survival
Yeah.
horror roots, and it's like, yeah, they did, but that's still pretty like it still has elements of
It's,
stupid,
like,
which I
yes.
like. I appreciate. I
very
haven't played the
outrageous.
games. I've watched similar to Aubrey, like, well, not similar to Aubrey because I watched no commentary playthroughs, like just the game. So, like, I've watched all of 7, and that might be the only one I've watched all the way through. But I've like seen bits and pieces of other games. I've watched anytime Indie Mouse puts out a video about one of these games, I'll watch it. But
That's so funny to me watching a no commentary. Like I get that you want to like experience it without experiencing it, like without having to be the one on like at the wheel, but
I just don't want some
Commentaries are
tryhard
so fun.
screaming over the top for like views whenever something mildly scary happens. So like
that's valid. You got to find the right one that works for you, which I also understand is way more work than you would want to do. But
yeah, I don't remember why I watched. I think it was just like slow at work when I was working at my last job and was like, everybody is always talking about Resident Evil 7 and how like scary it is. I want to just kind of watch the experience. And like the channel I found that did the no commentary, like the dude, it's not a let's play. Like he knows exactly like what thing to grab, what item. Like it's very
very much like
a
Golden
speed
Path.
run,
but he's doing everything like as quickly as possible without it being a speed run and without it being like just ridiculous to watch. So it's not like watching him fumble looking for a puzzle piece for whatever. It's not like a multi-part series. It was like one really beefy like 5-hour video or something of the whole game. So it wasn't, it was a pretty good way, actually, I would say, to like kind of experience the game if you like want to get what it's about, but don't want to play it yourself and also don't want some internet personality like yelling over it. So
yeah. The fun thing about the Resident Evil games too is because they've punched the boulder, the lore is just insane to dive into. And that's so fun to like, you know, you're running a bunch of errands all day long and the whole time you're just listening to this 4-hour video of someone breaking down the lore and the origins and, well, this thing from here and there's this newspaper clipping that shows that this was actually caused by, you know, that thing and they did this in the game, and that's just delightful.
I mean, it's basically the Kingdom Hearts of horror. They've because not only are there
so many
all the like numbered 1 through 8 games, but there's like
Code
Revelations
Veronica,
1 and 2, Code Veronica. Yeah, exactly. So like they have their little spin-offs too that like probably are very important to the lore. And then there's the whole movie series, which obviously is canon. So
Sounds like I don't care if it's canon, but you will put respect on their name.
It's so good. I own all of them. So
let's see. So I think that brings us to my number 2, which I put the Plague Tale series at my number 2.
Yep.
Nice.
Great series.
Basically, The Last of Us kind of gameplay, except you're playing as children. It's set in like the Middle Ages, and there is a supernatural infestation of rats. So like the tone is super like grim.
When he says infestation, you might be picturing 10 rats. You might be picturing 100 rats. That's too few rats.
Yeah, it's just like a sea of rats.
Hundreds of thousands of rats.
And in the first game, it doesn't really get to like uber ridiculous levels till like the final boss, where like the more supernatural stuff really kicks in. The second game, though, it's like entire cities just being collapsed by tidal waves of rats.
Yeah, it is crazy.
But outside of the rat stuff, like it doesn't pull its punches as far as like characters being in peril, visually, like just things being gruesome and gross. It's very intense in its presentation and its storytelling, but because it's set in kind of like that medieval slight fantasy setting, it really appeals to me a lot more than other probably horror style games, because I'm not really like, I'm not the biggest fan of horror, and I'm not the biggest fan of games that are like purely stealth. I much prefer being able to fight like action, which this game, like when I say purely stealth, it's not like we were talking about earlier where you just like can only run away or whatever. Like you have tools where you can like distract enemies, you can put out lights, you can kill 1 or 2 enemies in a pinch if you need to. Like you have the ability to kind of fight back, but you're a child, and the game leans into the fact that you are a child. And the second one, you're a little bit older and have a little bit more tools at your disposal. But when I say like primarily stealth, it's like hiding in bushes, hiding behind cover, putting out lights, sneaking around. Like that is the gameplay. It's not, you don't get to do that until you're caught and then you whip out your sword and get to just like start fighting everything. It's like, no, when that happens, it's all over.
Yeah. You may have like a get out of jail free card one time, but like it's not a combat. Like it's more of like a puzzle-y type of game. So.
Right. Which is what I was going to say next, is that like the whole thing with the rats is that they don't like light. And so the whole concept, like the core kind of idea of the gameplay is that if you can create light, the rats will avoid you. But if you can like extinguish the light from your human enemies, like guards that are looking for you or whatever, then the rats will go get them. And so it creates a lot of interesting opportunities, both gameplay wise, but just like visually.
Yeah.
For this like kind of light idea. And so Plague Tale 1 very much was like this double A studio kind of punching above their weight and just really, it was a Sobo. They just like knocked it out of the park with this game. And then 2 obviously was the sequel. And they had a little bit more of an identity, a little bit more kind of clout and probably money and production and stuff behind it, but also just did a really excellent job. I think if I was going to recommend you only, like if you could only play one of them, I'd probably recommend the first just as like being a more kind of contained experience. But like everything that 1 did, 2 expanded on, and then 2 just really like stuck a knife in your heart and twisted it at the end. So
I feel like
very
2
much
needs 1 to,
if you're gonna play 2, you need to play 1.
Yeah.
If you can only play one of them, one is the one to play. Yeah. But 2, I think they expanded on it in pretty much all the right ways. And then it ends in a way that kind of closes the chapter, the book on like this story, but throws a little bit of a, hey, but we could do more potentially here. So I'd be excited to see what they do with the series in the future. It's one of those, it's like the game, the series where I think that more people should play it. I think it doesn't get the recognition it deserves for how good it is. Requiem getting like a Game of the Year nomination was nice.
Yeah.
But like, I think that honestly, like, I think if you are into basically any of the elements that I've described and you try this game, you're going to like it. So it's a game that I always want to kind of get on my soapbox and recommend, but I also think that it kind of fits the bill of like being spooky, being gross, being gruesome, being horrific, like the rats, and just like the state of the world because of this plague and because of like, the kind of Inquisition thing that's going on. Like it's just, it's a maybe not so traditional setting for where we see horror, but I think that it 100% like falls into that horror category that we were talking about earlier.
Definitely. It seems like something I would enjoy if I were to like sit down and play it, but
oh, you 100% would, because the protagonist Amicia is like right up your alley as far as badass female protagonists, and not in like a like pandering kind of way. Like she is just a genuinely like really good character, and her relationship with her brother, and like I think that's probably the main thing that is so surprising about these games, especially the first one, is like you go into it thinking, oh, AA studio, they had their whole gimmick is like hundreds of rats on screen at one time, whatever, like that seems kind of interesting. And then you're like, wow, these characters are not only extremely well written and fantastic, but like extremely well voice acted and realized, and like you kind of just get super immersed and fall in love with the cast. And like it hurts when they hurt, it hurts when they die, like it hurts when things go bad. And so that, I think that's the part that like really elevates it above your expectations going into it, is just like how good and well realized these characters are.
Yeah.
Maybe soon, hopefully. Gotta get through all these homework games that we've given each other.
Yeah, we're close to the finish line on that one. Speaking of finish line, Aubrey, what's your number one game? You already said it, but...
I already said it, but my number one is the... I put specifically the Dark Pictures anthology.
Okay.
I do like The Quarry. I didn't really like the casting of Frank Stone, but that's neither here nor there.
We'll get into it
Yeah. You'll
Stay
hear all
tuned.
about that soon.
next week.
And I've never played Until Dawn. So like my strongest experience is with the Dark Pictures anthology. And like I stated previously, it is my most like traditional like horror that I have played. Like I said, I think Little Hope carried off the more like, again, traditional horror, like spooks and chases and things, and also did a better job with the psychological element than other games in the anthology. Dylan was talking about maybe doing a ranking list here soon. I think Man of Medan had some interesting ideas, but I just think about the like tutorial character Joseph and how like rough his southern accent was.
Yeah.
Did you see Ashley
ooh.
Tisdale's face? Because
Yeah, that's also pretty bad.
scary.
That's pretty bad. And we haven't beaten that one, and I haven't like watched a playthrough or seen the end of that one. So I don't know like how well it carries off its idea of. So far, I think all of the Dark Picture anthology ones are like, oh, you thought it was this monster, but it was actually, like in the case of Man of Medan, mold. Or in Little Hope, it's like, oh, it was all in this guy's head, like elements of it. And so
I think I remember when, was it House of Ashes that Ashley Tisdale's in?
Yeah.
I think I remember when that one came out, people being like, oh, this one's like harkens back to actual like real monsters. So we also never finished it, so I don't know like where that lands. But
if it was like, or what, wasn't that one like Aliens or something really weird? Anyway, I digress. Again, that's one where the quote unquote gimmick saves it of the couch co-op and being an activity you can do with friends and experiencing that. Because it really feels like one of those, if we were a much rowdier crowd, it feels like a movie where you'd like throw a handful of popcorn at the screen for like a particularly bad like line, whether written or delivered or something along those lines. And we did a whole episode on The Quarry a couple of years ago, so check that out if you're curious about our group dynamics and how we approach that. It's very fun to watch your friends go through something that spooky. Especially Delaney. She takes it to heart so immediately and just hates it so much. And when you're watching, it's like, it's literally not even that bad. It's fine. And then the controller's in your hand is like, there's 5 people who are going to watch me get my character killed. Like,
yeah, it's the audience.
Yeah.
You've been talking crap about the QuickTime events, and then you realize they don't loop around. That's the the stress of those games.
Yeah. And it's to that point of like, oh no, now their fates are all in my hand. But again, the Dark Pictures anthology helps a fair bit in that they're really good at making unlikable characters.
Yeah, you're like, I don't really care if this guy dies. Like,
exactly. So it's more about like a pride thing. Like, I don't want the failure point to be me, but also I don't like this guy. This guy's a jerk. Like, they can die. It's fine. So I think it strikes a really good balance that helps keep it accessible for both the quote unquote not real gamers, like was brought up quite a bit in the casting of Frank Stone. You know, let's see how a real gamer does it. And then also
poorly.
And then also like, again, some of the line readings are so rough or so out of left field or so ridiculous. I had a clip queued up of Jacksepticeye's playthrough of, the Murder House one. It's the one we haven't played yet.
Devil in Me.
The Devil in Me. Where, like, your character's in H.H. Holmes' like, murder house that he did during the World's Fair. And at one point, they're like, oh, we gotta stick together. And then one character goes, like, tearing off, like, outside of your control, goes tearing off, and then the walls start to separate. And then some guy, like, the graphics are so bad. He's just standing there, and the floor drops out, and he hangs there for a second like a Looney Tunes character before he falls down with just the worst, like, yell as he goes into the ground. And Sean is like, just like, oh yeah, we're supposed to stick together, immediately separate. And then that happens, and he has to like pause the game. He's laughing so hard because it was just bad across the board. And I think that's part of the charm of the supermassive games that really helps take the teeth out of it and just elevate it as like a co-op experience. Because in a ironic and genuine way, there's something so delightful about how not good they are. And we hope they continue making them.
Yes.
Yeah, I don't know how well they sell, but they so far have kept making them, so I'm sure we will.
And this is such a snarky, unkind comment, but maybe they just don't spend a lot of money on them, making them.
Well, yeah, I mean, the Dark Pictures especially, they're trying to they were initially trying to crank out like one a year. I don't know if they've
they backed
slowed down on that. Yeah.
They're they ended the first season or whatever, quote unquote, and I think the next one is set to come out in 2025.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
So, because the Dark Pictures is like their smaller experiences in between their more high budget things like The Quarry and Until Dawn, which I think are really the only two big, like the Casting in Frankston is like a weird
was not
in between where it's not part of the Dark Pictures, but it's not to the level that The Quarry or Until Dawn was either. So
yeah, Dead by Daylight threw them some money.
That's yeah.
And they were like, sure, we'll do our thing in your universe. But Dylan, what's your number one?
My number one is Dead Space. Dead Space is a really awesome game, I think.
Space sci-fi horror.
Yeah, like it hits basically everything that I'm looking for in a horror game. You know, like it gives you the ability to fight back, but also like does not make that fighting back easy necessarily. And if you're like freaking out, if you're panicking, if you're, you know, not playing in a way like if you are hesitating, if you are getting hung up on like, do I need to run? Do I need to shoot? Where do I need to shoot? Like you will die in this game. So I thought it did a very good job of feeling tense and keeping that tension throughout, even when it was giving you like weapons and upgrades. And that's because, you know, a lot of horror games, that's especially ones where they let you fight back. That's where it kind of falls off, is towards the back of the game where like, I know that's a criticism of Alien Isolation, is towards the back end of the game where you have a flamethrower and stuff. You can kind of just like scare it off and then it doesn't become as scary. But I think Dead Space does a very good job of just keeping the intensity up all the time, because it is throwing new things at you pretty regularly. And then also it is leaning into that survival horror aspect where it's like you have limited inventory, you have limited space, you can only hold so many, you know, things of ammo. Do you have enough ammo to like fight this stuff off? And yeah, you can unload a bunch of bullets into, or a bunch of like plasma, whatever, cutter things into the creature's body. But the way that you're killing them is like the ideal way is to like shoot for their limbs and cut off their limbs and stuff. And so, you know, that added bit of it, I think, helps keep that intensity up. And then I just really enjoyed the story and the lore of the Dead Space universe. I've enjoyed like the quarter to third of Dead Space 2 that I've played, and at some point I'll get back to it. And so I thought it did a very, like, the ending twist I thought was very good in Dead Space. Like I knew it was coming, but like I think it was still like the way that they played it out was cool. And then like even down to like a lot of the boss type stuff in the game, I thought they did that very well. That is, if you want to know more about Dead Space, I think we have a video on it on our YouTube channel.
We have a video, and it was also part of our video game swap kind of prologue, our first attempt at the video game swap idea. Yeah, so we all dabbled in it a little bit. That game was a little bit too spooky 5me, so like that's not one that I plan on really returning to, but like I definitely appreciate what it did. I was, like you said, I was kind of interested in the story and lore, so like I did go watch some videos and stuff on it after I played like my required few chapters. I can definitely see why you like it. It's very much up your alley. It kind of, like you said, it kind of checks all the boxes for you. So That's and I do appreciate the ability to fight back in the way that you can do it. And I also appreciate like just kind of how cutting edge it was for its time.
Yeah.
Like when it originally came out, like the no HUD and the shooting off the limbs and stuff like that, that was all really very interesting, very cool, very novel concepts at that time.
Because that was like 360 era, you know?
Yeah, it was like pretty early 360.
And the remaster is genuinely beautiful.
Yeah.
Well, it's a remake.
Remake, not just remaster.
Yeah, that's one where they like put a decent amount of effort into it rather than just like making it look a little better and run on modern consoles.
Up the graphics, yeah. The remake is genuinely beautiful. And it's one of those, again, like, it seems like it has a really interesting story, but the gameplay is not for me. So I will watch a playthrough and read about the plot and all that good stuff.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Whereas Resident Evil's, the Resident Evil lore goes super goofy. The Dead Space lore goes super dark. So
yeah, it's like, this is not gonna end happy.
Well, yeah, it wouldn't be horror. That leads us to my number one, which is Bloodborne.
What? No, really?
Yeah, I mean, Bloodborne is like my second favorite game of all time, so it makes sense that it would land at the number one spot of like horror spooky games. It is definitely like a FromSoft Souls-like action game, but the enemies you're fighting, the world you're inhabiting, the messed up things that happen, like it is one part werewolves and like
gothic horror.
One part like werewolves and gothic horror and like 2 parts cosmic horror. Like if you finish that game, I don't know how you could. Like, I think you can look at the gameplay and you can say, this doesn't fit in line with like typical horror or survival horror style games. But the content of it, like this is FromSoft making a cosmic horror video game. Like it is 100% like, and it's done so well. Like I think the number one critique of Bloodborne is probably like Chalice Dungeons, and they're not very well realized gameplay wise, but like lore wise and how they fit with the history and the storyline of Bloodborne are like super interesting and perfect. Like the whole thing of like the hunters and then the city of Yharnam like disturbing the old ones and trying to recreate their own like cosmic deity, and what the different endings you can have with your character, whether like, you know, escaping the nightmare, being trapped, becoming a cosmic deity. Like it is classic FromSoft in the way that you kind of have to like do the work to get the story.
Yeah.
But once you do, it's like, yeah, this is some seriously messed up cosmic horror.
Yeah. Yeah. It is very excellently crafted. And like cosmic horror is one I feel like that is very hard to do in a lot of video games, and I think Bloodborne executes on it like masterfully, you know? Like a lot of the cosmic horror type or style of games, like it's a lot of it is about telling, not showing. And Bloodborne, I think I think just the way that From Software makes games, but Bloodborne specifically, I think does a very good job of like fitting right into that, where it's, you know, you're not going up against, you know, Cthulhu necessarily, you know, like there are some things in Bloodborne that you can fight with your weapons, but you know, it's not like, oh, you killed Cthulhu, good job, all's good now, you know, like, which is the part that a lot of like games shooting for cosmic horror get wrong.
Yeah, and at like just a surface base level, you are a hooded figure in a strange town with a really rough looking saw attached to a stick hacking away at these beastmen. Like, at the very least, you're just like trying to purge this town of these like mutated beast people. But then the further in you get, it's like, oh no, there's something way deeper here going on there. And then there's like characters that are like either chosen or are trying to make themselves be the vessel to like bring a new old one into the world. And like, you know, like it's you can blitz through that game and just kind of get the vibes and be like, yeah, that was kind of a creepy, weird, spooky video game. But if you actually like kind of dig into like, why do I have to collect 3 umbilical cords to get the true ending? Like, there's just a lot of weird cosmic, like sci-fi horror kind of stuff. And then it's all like the kind of chef's kiss of it all is just being set in like the Victorian, like England Gothic setting, which lends itself to the cosmic horror, but like FromSoft and the level design, like just it's just it's a perfect marriage of like kind of game design and setting, in my opinion.
Yeah.
Yet that statement of why do you have to get 3 umbilical cords to get the good ending? That provoked a
good.
Well, the true ending, I should say.
Okay, true ending. That provoked a horrified feeling in me. Not like an outrageous one, but there was definitely like, ugh.
Well,
gross.
Death Stranding has a lot to do with umbilical cords too. So like if you like that, go check that game out.
No. Horrified response. I'm not really into weirdness concerning fetuses.
On that note, that is our top 3 favorite spooky / horror games. And now I think is a good time to move into our community responses. We reached out to our Discord community and asked them what their favorite, specifically their top 3 favorite like horror / spooky games were. And if you want to be part of conversations and topics like this in the future, the only way to do that is to join our Discord server. We have a channel in there where we are going to be leveraging the opinions of our community more often. So we asked the community, what is your favorite spooky horror games? And these are the responses we got. There are going to be some games in here that I have no idea about, but we're going to roll with it. So starting off, we got a response from Matthew Bliss, who said, A Semblance, Slenderman, 8 Pages, and PT. I know what PT is. Do you guys know what A Semblance? I mean, I know what Slenderman is. I don't know about this game specifically.
I know that game. That game sounds like the one that was like big in the early days of the Let's Play YouTube scene, where it was like you're just kind of wandering around a dark forest looking for
8 pages,
and I think the more pages you pick up, the more
more active and aggro he gets.
I don't know what A Semblance is, but I'm curious now because I looked it up and it says it's a little bit of PT mixed with the Stanley Parable. It's a psychological horror thriller.
Sounds like a game I will never play.
You can play it for $7.99 on the Nintendo Switch. So,
nope.
But yeah, so that sounds interesting.
Like a liminal horror.
Yeah. Well, and it came out in like 2016 or something apparently. So it's not like a new game. It's right. 8 years old at this point. I'm interested.
If anybody I follow has played that.
And then PT you can watch, I guess, if you want to experience that one. Cause
unless you have it, it's gone.
Yep. Yeah. I highly recommend the Game Grumps playthrough.
PT stands for Playable Teaser, leading into the Silent Hill game that never was.
Yep. Mm-hmm. Kojima, man.
Well, I mean, it wasn't his fault that game never...
No.
But yeah, PT was Kojima.
That was one of his... Would have been interesting to see what he'd done with with that property.
I went back and watched the trailer for his Silent Hill when I was editing the Death Stranding episode, just to kind of see, because I couldn't remember if like the beach stuff and the baby stuff was in that trailer, and it's not. That was much more Death Stranding than Silent Hill. But yeah, Silent Hill was still Guillermo del Toro and Kojima and Norman Reedus, and very, very interesting. We've been curious to see how that shook out. But our next response came from the real Dave Jackson, and he says Soma, Resident Evil 4, and Devotion.
Resident Evil 4 is the one I think we all know.
Yeah.
Soma,
you have to live under a rock.
Yeah. Soma, I think, is I've
heard
like
of
an
Soma.
Existential horror game that I've heard very good things about, but I've not played. It's on my list of stuff that I want to check out. And then Devotion, I think, was that game that got like banned or something.
Because it had like Winnie the Pooh.
Yeah, but I think it's like
it had the Chinese government banned it or something. Yeah,
but I think it's kind of like the gameplay I've seen of it reminded me a lot of like Phasmophobia, but like single player.
Oh, gotcha.
And I think it's set in like Taiwan or something. So
yeah, that sounds about right.
But I've heard good things about it. But
China
it was one that I was
mad
like,
about it.
Sounds awful.
That is an interesting subgenre of horror that I was listening to horror lore videos while I was riding around doing a lot of stuff for work, and the one channel that I found that I listened to for quite a while was all of these like smaller, like kind of like Taiwanese or these ones that like Asian countries had made that were Japan can do some horror.
Godzilla.
And
yeah, they have
the indie horror scene over there is pretty freaky.
Yeah.
Yeah. Then we got a response from John with no H, who said, I'll preface this by saying horror isn't particularly my genre of choice, but my picks are Silent Hill 2, Dead Space, and Alien Isolation. So
Nice.
Horror isn't particularly my genre of choice, but here are some of the like top horror games of this genre.
Yeah.
Yes. So Silent Hill 2 is one that I want to play, but have not. I may
The
pick up
remake is apparently pretty
eventually.
good.
So
Yeah.
Isn't that the one that introduced like Triangle Head?
Yeah.
Pyramid
Yeah.
Head.
Pyramid Head.
Pyramid Head. That
Triangle
is some-
Head.
I know.
The iconic
is-
figure.
Yes. That is some great like horror monster design right there.
Yep.
Yes.
Pyramid Head is peak.
Then we got a response from Mr. Eric Almighty, who said, horror also isn't my main go-to genre, but it'd be Dead Space, Alan Wake, and I've been pleasantly surprised in my brief experience with Five Nights at Freddy's. Note,
Nice.
I've got Alien Isolation downloaded and want to give it a shot. From what I've seen, I wouldn't be shocked if this was a contender too.
Yeah, Five Nights at Freddy's, because it hit like such online
Mm-hmm.
success, and especially like within that, you know, annoying YouTubers reacting kind of space, I think, I mean, it did great things for that franchise, and it, you know, ballooned it out to incredible success and everything, and ultimately was all for the best, but it did kind of unfairly, I don't even think it like truly legitimized, but it takes it out of some of the conversations. But it is like you have a fair bit of control over the environment.
Yeah.
Like it is one where you can affect your survival rates and like what you can do. And I do think it hits that balance pretty well, at least from what I've seen, in terms of the control you have over the environment while also very much being stuck in place. Like, and then, yeah, animatronics and puppets are just creepy.
Yes.
Especially
when
old,
they're
worn
like,
down ones
run down. Yeah.
from a nasty, you know, Chuck E. Cheese knockoff. And I quite enjoyed the movie.
Yeah, I want to watch the movie, and I want to play the one that I'm most like the ones where you're just kind of like sitting doing the cameras are not the most interesting to me. And they lean a bit heavy on like the jump scares for me.
Yeah.
But I do want to play the like security breach one where you're in like you're the Chuck E. Cheese
in the Pizzaplex and you can run around. Yeah.
It's more of like a Resident Evil, but like you don't have a gun or anything. Like it's like
you do get a laser gun eventually that can
okay.
stun your enemies
Sounds
for
terrible.
a little bit. It's hopefully it's better with all the patches and everything, but it was like an 80 gigabyte game that like crashed a lot when it first launched. There's like a 40-minute video of like Markiplier losing his patience with security breach as he's slowly getting more and more like, let me love you.
Yep.
The idea of exploring an abandoned Chuck E. Cheese is enough for me to be like, no, I'm good. They don't even, like, the puppets, the animatronics, they don't even have to come to life. Just walking
they can
around.
Just be there.
Yeah. An old abandoned Chuck E. Cheese with no lights on. I'm like, nah, I'm good.
Yeah. Well, it's not abandoned. I think the kid gets like locked in there overnight or something.
Oh, so it's like a modern
in Five Nights at Freddy's or in Security Breach?
Security Breach. Not Five Nights at Freddy's is definitely like, this is an abandoned Chuck E. Cheese. You're the security guard. Security Breach is like while it was still active, or they're revive. I don't know. I would have to look at the lore, and we don't have the time to open that can of worms. So,
in the original, it is still open. It's still like an operating pizza party place kind of place. You're just the nighttime security guard from midnight to 6 a.m. shift. But at the end of the game, it does get shut down because of nasty, suspicious odors coming from the animatronics because, you know, they're eating people. A security breach, you're a kid who like hid in there after and like was stayed there after closing. And so it's still got quite a bit of like pizzazz and the like 90s carpet but it's like operational, and I want to say like set during that era. Like it is still,
I think it was set. I think it's set
not
after,
like defunct or abandoned or spooky.
I think it's set in the modern era, but like they're trying to do like a revival of the
yeah, it looks very retro, but everything's like clean and shiny and neon and whatnot. But it is set later. The FNAF floor is insane.
Correct.
Because the creator refuses to confirm anything.
Just like Zelda.
Yep.
So then we got a response from Deku Scrub, who is Caleb Van Ice, who's been on a handful of episodes on this show. And he says, Resident Evil 2 Remake, Castlevania, the NES one, but Symphony of the Night is excellent vibes, Alien Isolation, and then he finished with, I limited myself to one game per series, or else it would all be Resident Evil games.
Fair.
Yeah, I definitely didn't think of the Castlevania games, which they feel more to me kind of like the Hugh Jackman Van Helsing movie than they do like a horror experience. But I do like the Castlevania series and the shows. The Netflix shows are both really good. Castlevania and Castlevania Nocturne. I am excited for season 2 of that.
Yeah, I like the shows quite a bit, and Castlevania is one that like I would love to see kind of like a modern return to that franchise. I remember like I have nostalgia for some of the old games, but like so many Metroidvania games have kind of like evolved that genre now that it's like I feel like going back to the original, like the older Castlevanias would be a bit rough, but I like the setting a lot. So I'd like to kind of see a return to that franchise, which who knows? We'll see if that happens, but
it is a Capcom series, right? So
is it Capcom or Konami?
Konami? That's a good question.
I think it's Konami.
Yeah, I want to say it's Konami because it's like, hey, you guys own Metal Gear and Castlevania, and what are you doing?
If it's Konami, that makes a lot more sense as to why we haven't seen anything.
You look that up while I read our final response, which is from Starlord07.
It is Konami. So
yeah,
never mind. I thought it was Capcom, and I was like, well, we could see a new one.
Yeah. I mean, Konami is looking like they're getting back into games a bit now with like the Metal Gear remake and some of these other things. So maybe we'll see, and we got the Dead Cells Castlevania crossover. So like maybe we'll see some new Castlevania stuff, but
And the Dead by Daylight crossover.
Yeah, and that.
Speaking of,
look forward to next week's episode.
well, and Star-Lord.
Yes, our final response was from Starlord07, who said Dead by Daylight, The Forest, and Resident Evil.
I want to play The Forest. I was
going to say, I hear a lot about The Forest, but like I know very little about it.
It is like a survival crafting.
I was going to say, it's like crafting,
yes.
base building kind of, yeah.
But then also very much like spooky horror, body horror stuff.
Didn't a sequel come out recently? Didn't Forest 2?
Sons of the Forest.
That's right.
Yeah. Yeah, that's one that I've watched Markiplier and friends, the people he does his Distractable podcast with. Great chemistry together. They're all very funny. Watch them do.
I was going to say, we're like the number one Markiplier promoters
Fancast.
This episode.
But I mean, that's how I consume horror games, okay, guys? But yeah, their playthrough of it was very funny, and they did get all the way like to the very end and actually beat it, and it's pretty weird.
Yep. Yeah, there's a lot that you, as you go further in that game, there is a lot that changes, I guess.
Yeah.
Is a mild way to put it.
Yeah, like you said with the body horror and the moment when they first came across the like woman who was like had like 8 legs or something all like stitched to her, and she's like running around shrieking and naked and awful. Yeah, it's it's bonkers. And then the babies in the caves are just oof.
Well, sounds like another game to add to list of games that I will never play. But I do appreciate all of the responses that we got from our Discord community. Thank you everybody for responding, adding to this episode. If you enjoy horror games, here's a great list for you to go check out, except for PT because it's unavailable.
Well, you can spend $10,000 on a PlayStation 3 that's still got it installed, right?
Or a PS4, I think. I think it was PS4.
Was it PS4? Okay.
Yeah.
That claims it has it installed.
Yeah,
True.
Exactly. Then you just get an empty box. But that's the real horror. But yeah, I think that is it for the list of horror and spooky games that we have and that our community was kind enough to provide. A little bit of housekeeping here as far as the podcast. What we've got coming up is we have an episode on the casting of Frank Stone, which we've referenced a few times on this episode, but we got the Corey group back together. We played that game, and we're going to record a big group episode about it, so definitely be looking forward to that. And then after Halloween and spooky time is over, we will be kicking off our Game Swap month, where we will be diving into some games that we have recommended strongly that the others play. And so each of us brought a game to the table that the others had to play. We played a substantial amount of it, and then we were going to do full episodes on each of those games throughout the month of November. And then we will be moving into our end of year content on the podcast, which is always some of my favorites. So a lot to look forward to on the podcast front. Dylan, what do we have going on YouTube?
So on the YouTube front, earlier this month, we had a video come out on Flintlock, The Siege of Dawn. If you're into AA games or Souls-likes, you might be interested in checking that one out. And then I believe the next one that we've got coming out is on Thymesia? Is that how you say it?
That's how I say it. I don't know if that's the correct way to say it. Thymesia.
Which checks that same box. So if this is a very, month of AAs and Souls-likes.
What? More Souls-like content on YouTube?
Right? Andrew likes them. Andrew plays them. Andrew records the script for them. And then I put together a video. And then we may be having some other bonus content coming to the YouTube channel as well. And if you are primarily a podcast listener only on YouTube, our backlog of podcast episodes that existed before we made before we uploaded them to YouTube will slowly be trickling out as well.
Cool. And if you like what you hear on YouTube or the podcast, a like, a subscribe, a 5-star rating, all those things go a long way in helping us grow the show, grow the community, all that good stuff. It helps us with the various algorithms that we don't have a lot of control of. And so we would greatly appreciate that from you if you enjoy the content that we are providing. With all that being said, this has been another one of our spooky Halloween themed episodes for this month. Thank you all so much for listening, and we will catch you on the next one.